We're back with the Chara Project. I'm Sarah.
And I'm Heather.
Our goal is to help you build confidence in studying the Bible. And the way we do that is we use our Chara Bible Study Guide. And in that guide, you can find questions to ask that will walk you through the context of the Bible, the history, how to understand the author, how to research and dig a little deeper, and how to apply it to your lives. And so within that, what we're going to focus on today is actually something that you will find under one of the author questions, and it's about the different literary styles or genres that you find in the Bible. There's about 9 different major genres, and this is something I'd never even grasped or thought about growing up, reading the Bible and doing Bible studies. And so it's quite fascinating for me to learn this. But on page 11 of our Chara guide, which you can download on our website, we actually list the 9 different literary guides. And today we're going to talk about the law and how do we actually study the law? Because these are things that would have been familiar. These genres would have been familiar to the original audience. They would have known how to hear it, how to understand it. It would have been very common in their day. Just like different styles, how to read, fiction or a novel or news or satire, that's familiar to us, and we expect different things when we read those. So these different styles would have been familiar to the original audience. And today we're going to start this series. We're going to do a whole series here, and we're going to start off with law.
Yeah, well, and honestly, there's a lot of funky laws that are in the Old Testament that I think can get quite confusing and not make sense to us today. We're quite removed from that culture of that time. And so it's a really good topic for us to be going over. I have a lot of people I know that are like, oh, I don't like reading the Old Testament. It's really hard because I don't understand this rule book that is kind of set in place in part of the Bible. And it feels like God is just giving me a list of rules that I have to follow. And so what a great topic for us to talk about today. I want to talk about 3 different things when it comes to the Old Testament law. I want to talk about what is the law, so we kind of just get a level set of what we're going to study. What's its purpose is number 2, and then number 3, how are we going to study it? How do you get the most out of studying the law? So let's dive right in and talk about what the law is. Let me back up and say that the law is located within the first 5 books of the Old Testament. You see Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Typically, those 5 books are also called the Torah. They're called the Pentateuch. Torah just means teaching of and instruction, which makes sense. You can also often hear it called the Law of Moses. Jesus referred to this quite a bit, where he talked about the law and the prophets. And so he's referring to the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible of that time. And it's these 5 books that is where we see God give laws to the Israelites. The literary style of law itself, the actual laws themselves, are most likely found in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And we're going to be camping in the majority of those books today because Genesis is more of a narrative story.
Yeah, that actually brings up a point that is worth making. We'll make it more than once, is that within one book of the Bible, you can have more than one genre, more than one literary style. And as you just mentioned, even within these books, Genesis is a great example. Genesis is mostly narrative, which is stories of people in the past. And so that's what we're going to cover next is these narratives. But Exodus also is a combination of both law and narrative as well.
That's right. So you're going to see them overlap. But let's focus in on these Old Testament laws just to give us a level set. There are 613 laws that God gave the Israelite people in the Old Testament that's found in those books, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And while I'd love for us to all read all 4 books right now, and I will open, we're not going to do that today.
Who counted them?
That's right. Like who's sitting there meticulously counting all 613? Let's give you the Cliff Notes version, because the law in these books outline basically how to live in the land, how to live with each other, how to have a right relationship with God. And so we need to keep in mind that at the beginning of the Bible, we see the majority of the laws were given to the Israelite people after they had spent 400 years in slavery in Egypt. Okay, so at the end of Exodus, at the beginning of Exodus, we see that Moses exits these people out of Egypt, and while they're on their way to the promised land is when these laws are given. And so they were wandering into the desert with no governing system, no rules, and a lot of people to manage. And so starting in Exodus, God invites them into this covenant relationship with him, and he instructs Moses to write down these laws as a way to instruct them on how to follow as part of the covenant terms, this old covenant terms. And that continues on through Leviticus and Numbers. By the time we get to Deuteronomy, we see Moses talking to the generation of Israelites whose grandparents and parents had kind of messed up the law and they weren't following the stuff. So he ends up repeating the law back to them to make sure that they truly understand it so that they don't fall away from the generation previously.
Right. And so Deuteronomy, it actually means second law or repetition of the law. So when you're looking at Deuteronomy, you're going to see some repetition. You're going to see some of these laws and you're like, oh my gosh, I've already read these. Why am I reading them again? Well, it has a lot to do with what you just were talking about. He's repeating these laws to the next generation who's going to be entering into the promised land, and they needed a reminder. So you can see, repetition in like the 10 Commandments, both are listed in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5.
That's right. That's right. So, what are these 613 laws? How do we break them down? This simply put, there are three kinds of laws. If you were to take all 613 and bucket them into categories, there are three. There's moral, there's civil, and there's ceremonial. Let me back out and talk about each. The moral law is outlining God's eternal standard. What I mean by this is the moral law is considered to be God's unchanging principles between good and evil. These are things like the 10 Commandments: do not murder, do not steal. It's what's written on humanity's heart for them to understand the difference between good and evil. It's how we as humans understand what's right and wrong. The second is civil, which is how we live with each other. And God provides rules on how to get along with each other in society. Remember, they had been separated from, their own instruction for 400 years under slavery. They were kind of told what to do, and then all of a sudden they didn't have a governing system. These civil laws now teach them how to get along with each other, and it contains criminal laws for the nation to help them know how to govern. You see laws like in Exodus 22 where it says, do not mistreat an oppressed foreigner, giving understanding of how to treat people that come into the camp. It also has interesting things like do not lend money to a person with and charge them interest. So it's like it's trying to teach them how do you play nice with each other in a really easy way. And then the third kind of law is ceremonial, and this is how do we worship God. This is trying to govern God, how God was worshipped in the Old Testament, because God was so holy, is so holy. It's man's response to him. And so Leviticus and Numbers is where you see a majority of these laws come to play, where they talk about food offerings, animal sacrifices, as a way to present to God for atoning for the sins of people and to show gratitude for their gratefulness for who he is as a person or as a God. And so moral, ceremonial, and civil laws are kind of how they get broken out in probably the simplest terms.
Yeah, no, that is really helpful to understand the different types. And by the time we get to the New Testament, these 613 laws kind of took on a life of their own.
Yeah, that's true.
And they grew and expanded. And the reason is because the Pharisees and the Jewish leaders, religious leaders at the time, began to add on to these laws, mostly to clarify the laws or give some further instruction, but they ended up adding thousands, or at least 1,000 new unnecessary and unneeded commandments that made it really, really hard for the people to follow. For example, the Jewish scholars, they added 39 separate categories of what work meant when it came to the Sabbath, and such as like how many steps can you take on the Sabbath? These were the kinds of things that they were adding on here. In essence, what they were doing is kind of creating bubble wrap around the law, right? Like if this is the law, honor the Sabbath or do not work on the Sabbath. Well, what does that mean? And so then they added all these extra, laws bubble wrap to make sure you didn't violate the first one. And so really when we get to the New Testament, a lot of Jesus' conflict with the Pharisees and with the religious leaders were because of these added laws. And Jesus is saying that's not a part of Scripture. That's not how you should interpret it. And you carry this burden, this yoke that these people cannot follow.
Yeah, well, and it helps understand why sometimes Jesus gets a little bit snarky in some moments with them, because he's like, wait a second, you're doing it wrong, you guys. So what's the purpose of the law? Our second thing I wanted to talk about today is making us understand what was its purpose and why was it even in the Bible. Well, when we read the full story of the Bible, we start to get the context of why the Old Testament law is there. There's three reasons that I want to call out today. The first is that the law shows us the character and the wisdom of God. We see a pattern almost, if you look at the laws, that it starts to come out about who God is and what his desires are. He wants our complete devotion. He wants us to get along with and love our neighbor. He wants us to be holy. Leviticus 19:2 says, be holy because I, the Lord your God, am holy. He had that desire for us.
And that sounds like, that's a pretty intimidating verse, right? And in essence, what holy means is to be set apart, to be distinct from the rest. And God does, He wants us to live our lives set apart from others. Our lives should look different. And telling these people, like you were just mentioning, they had just spent 400 years in Egypt and were constantly surrounded by other gods, and how these other people worshiped their gods. Their way of worshiping God should look different.
Absolutely. That's a great call out. The second purpose for the law is that it shows us how sinful we are. We actually hear about this in a couple different books in the New Testament. Again, that story of the Bible helps us kind of put the Old Testament law into context. Romans 3:20 says, "Therefore, no one will be declared righteous in God's sight by the works of the law. Rather, through the law, we become conscious of our sin, because all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." We become conscious of our sin.
Yes, that's something else that we see. That idea is repeated in the book of Hebrews.
Yeah, that's right.
In the book of Hebrews, it talks about these annual sacrifices that the people had to make repeated, every year, and in large part so that they would remember their sin. And they might think, well, gosh, why would we want to remember our sin? But that helps us also remember that we are separated from God and that we do need a Savior.
No, it's a great segue, because the third purpose of the law is to point to our need for Jesus.
Yeah.
If the laws were meant to show us how sinful we are in our separation from God, then we also realize that we are in need of being saved. And that's where Jesus enters the scene. Hebrews 10 speaks of it pretty clearly. It says the law is only a shadow of good things that were coming. And it's impossible for the blood of animals to take away our sins, but we were made holy, again, that word holy, through the sacrifice of the body of Jesus Christ once and for all. Even in the Old Testament, the obedience of the law was not a means to salvation. It was put in place to help us realize we were always in need of saving. There was no way we'd be able to be perfect and holy enough to keep all 613 laws. It's in essence, it's saying, once Jesus comes, you understand the power of who he is and what he brings, because he covers it once and for all.
And thank goodness. I mean, so Jesus covers it. He accomplished it. He fulfills that law. And really, so these Old Testament laws really don't apply anymore for the most part. In Matthew 5:17, it says, "Do not think that Jesus says, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." So Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament law that nobody could keep perfectly except for Jesus.
Totally.
Right? And we are in a new covenant relationship with God through Jesus. We see that in Romans 10:4. Christ is the culmination of the law so that there may be righteousness for everyone who believes. I mean, really, what a relief. I mean, if you're living in the Old Testament time and you have these annual reminders, and sacrifices to remember your sin, and Jesus comes and we are now saved through faith in him, right? Through faith in him that he has fulfilled this law for us. Man, his grace just stands out so significantly. What an incredible blessing that is for us today.
No, totally. And I love it that because, even in the New Testament, it talks about how Abraham's faith, even in the Old Testament, is what counted him righteous. It was his faith in God. And that's a lot of what these laws are really trying to get at, is the idea of, are you willing to put your full trust into God? Those laws were all pointing to that, of God wanting your reliance on him as a heart. Okay, so how do we get the most out of the law? How do we study this? If you're not an Old Testament guru and love getting yourself a good read through the book of Numbers, let me first tell you that because it's so clear that Jesus fulfilled the Old Testament law, you spoke to this already, the Old Testament laws are really not applicable to us anymore from a following perspective, at least the civil and the ceremonial laws that are put in place. Like, I just want to make that clear. Like, I don't have to worry about some of the sacrificial systems that they've put in place in the Old Testament, because Jesus has now fulfilled those pieces.
Yeah, Jesus is our once for all sacrifice that we do read about again in Hebrews.
Right.
Yeah. And so I'm glad that you did that call out, because I think they could get kind of confusing how much those laws were, apply to me today in the Old Testament. And if you're familiar with the New Testament at all, and Jesus, when he's asked, well, what are the two most important commandments? And how does he respond? He says, love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. And so in essence, all of those commandments funnel down and are into these two. In fact, you can actually see that when you look at the 10 commandments. You see the first 5 really have to do with loving God, and the second 5 really have to do with loving your neighbor. So Jesus fulfilled the law, but he kept the heart of the law really is wrapped up in these 2 commandments: love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself.
Oh, I love that. And so just because the Old Testament law isn't necessarily applicable doesn't mean that we shouldn't read them or try to understand them. So we're not saying just, go and just read the New Testament now because we keep on pointing to it. No, the fact that the Old Testament law isn't applicable, but it helps us understand Jesus's fulfillment. It actually makes the Old Testament law that much more interesting to study, at least in my opinion, because we understand the depth and the impact and the significance of Jesus' death on the cross when we understand the heaviness of the laws that were put in place originally.
Yeah, I think you said that beautifully, really. I mean, if any of you have tried to sit down and read the Bible front to back,
Yeah.
and you might have lost traction somewhere around Leviticus.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot.
Yeah.
It's a tough book. There's a lot of laws in that book. However, I have heard of a few people who have actually studied Leviticus and come afterwards going, I love it. It's one of my
favorite books, right?
It's one of my favorite books in the Bible, and you think, what in the world? But I think once you understand what these people went through, and like you just were talking about, the heaviness of what it was and God's intent behind it, and it just brings it to life, and it makes the gift of Jesus so much sweeter.
I completely agree. So there's some questions that we would have you ask when you're reading the law that are always good to have on hand. One of the questions you should be asking is, what's the spirit of the law? Like, what are the actual types of laws that you're seeing and that you're coming across? Is it ceremonial? Is it moral? Is it civil? Try to help categorize what's the spirit behind what is being asked. The second question is, well, why did God give the law? Oftentimes, if we understand the history of the time period, it helps us understand why the law was maybe put in place. There's some really confusing laws. I'm going to talk about a few in a second, but they can get a little confusing. Why was that there? It will help us if we actually understand the history. Fourth question is, how does this show us God's character and desire, right? We already talked about that. That's one of the purposes behind the law, is to help understand God more. We should ask that question almost every time we read the Bible. What does this passage tell me about who God is and his desires, his attributes? Does the same thing applies to when we study the law? And then how does loving God and loving your neighbor, how does that get fulfilled here? Like, how do we see loving God and loving your neighbor encapsulated in the law that we're studying at that time? Let me give us an example just to kind of camp. Like maybe you're like, Heather, I haven't heard of a confusing law in the Old Testament, or I'm not brushed up on my Old Testament law recently. Let me give you a couple of examples. Number one is in Leviticus 19:28, it talks about do not cut your bodies for the dead or put tattoo marks on yourselves. Now everybody's leaning in. I can almost see you guys all leaning in. Wait a second, Heather's talking about tattoos. Are we allowed to have them or aren't we? Leviticus 19 says no. Well, why did God give us this law? That's the question we want to ask, right? What was the history behind what was going on? Well, if we look at the time period and the cultures around the Israelites, they were all cutting their bodies. The other surrounding nations were cutting their bodies for the dead. So God was giving them this law to make sure that they were setting themselves apart from the surrounding nations to make themselves holy. It was specifically for those people at that time because they were dealing with people that were doing something similar. And the same thing goes for Leviticus 19:19, where it says, do not wear clothing woven of two kinds of material. It's a very similar vibe. The other nations surrounding them were intermixing fabrics. I can tell you right now, I'm intermixing fabrics with what I'm wearing today. It's not something I have to follow anymore because that is not how I set myself apart. My holiness is coming through Jesus.
I love those two examples because I want to actually highlight those four questions that you mentioned because I think they are so important. So I'm going to highlight them one more time.
Yeah.
What is the spirit of the law? Why did God give this law? I think both of those are such great questions. What do you learn about God in that? Yep. Right? And then also, how does this apply really to this idea of loving God and love your neighbor? How do you see that live out in these laws? Those are great examples. And those questions really do help kind of address those rather strange laws.
They really do. I mean, and there's one more law I'm going to throw out here. It's kind of a funny one. My husband thinks this is like the best law I don't know why he likes this one. Well, I know why he likes this one. Deuteronomy 23:12-14 says, designate a place outside your camp where you can go relieve yourself.
Yep, that's it.
That's it. And it goes on to talk about how the Lord wants to move throughout your camp to protect you and to deliver you from your enemies. The camp must be holy so that we can not be seen among you anything that's indecent and be turned away from the sin. So here we see God, again, the spirit of the law is that God wants the ground that you're around to be holy so that he can protect you and move about your camp. But I think it's funny that it's almost intermixed with a little bit of a civil law and a ceremonial, there's a little bit of all the laws mixed in here a little bit because there's also probably a hygiene issue
Yeah.
with keeping your potty inside the camp.
I'm thinking so. Like there could be some health concerns there that they probably wouldn't be aware of in that day,
exactly.
but God was. So I can see that maybe crossing over in some of those too.
But in addition to wanting to separate them and keep them holy as a
Yeah.
ceremonial piece, there's definitely probably some civil, how do you get along with your neighbor? Let's not have your potty nearby them. So, but
Dump it in front of their tent.
but my husband's favorite law. So there you have it. You know, when we go to study law, you know, how do we, you know, Sarah and I are smart. I consider us smart, Sarah.
Thank
but,
you.
But I also think that part of what makes us smart is by the tools that we use when we study. And so
there we go.
Yeah. So I want to recommend just like what tool what are we using when we go to study law? What are the tools that we use to be able to understand it better? And I'll tell you this, a good study Bible or a commentary is really helpful when studying law, because there are often these odd laws that come up, like tattoos or mixing fabric. And a study Bible or commentary is going to help you understand the history. They'll speak to what was happening in surrounding pagan nations, surrounding the Israelites, that would help you understand what the law is actually saying. So if you don't have a good study Bible, we have a bunch of recommendations on our website for you, as well as different commentaries that really do provide the historical context that I think we miss living in 2025. So just that's a last call out. If you haven't gotten yourself a good study Bible, I recommend doing it, especially if you're going to be getting into any of the literary style of studying law.
Absolutely. I think it's some of those odd laws, particularly strange ones or off-putting laws that we see, you know, all over the internet, all over social media, all over billboards. And it's like, how could you worship a God that says this? And this is where, guys, you got to do your homework. You got to do a little bit of homework and figure out, go back in their culture and figure out what it meant back then, why it was given, and all this. And you're right. This is particularly where a lot of these commentaries and study Bibles really help us. So, future podcasts we can go into more of these fun laws.
Yeah.
But Heather, that was really helpful. So thank you for tackling this one, and specifically the law that I think can be a little bit confusing or again off-putting for a lot of people. Hopefully this is incredibly helpful. Join us next time as we study narrative or the historical stories that we see particularly in the Old Testament, but New Testament as well. And you can also visit our website to find for more resources, to download the Chara Bible Study Guide, as well as other resources and information on these literary styles. Make sure you subscribe to the Chara Project, like and comment. That really helps us out. And boy, we appreciate you joining us today, and we'll catch you next time.